Max Rockatansky is back in MadMax2, otherwise known as the Road Warrior. Released in 1981, Mel Gibson returns to the iconic role, where Max is now a drifter in the wasteland, where he drives around in his V8 Interceptor with his dog, dodging all kinds of violent savages. Max teams up with a conniving but likeable gyro captain, where he discovers a small community in the middle of no man's land, whom have an oil refinery and can produce gasoline. An evil wasteland gang led by the dangerous Humongous threatens to destroy the community if they don't hand over the gasoline. Max offers the community help to safely get away from the evil gang and lead them into salvation in this action-packed car chase spectacle, which is probably just as good, if not better, than its original. So today we are going to explore MadMax2, or as it's known in the States, The Road Warrior, the movie that made Mad Max a hugely popular franchise. So let's check it out.
You want to get out of here? You talk to me.
Number 10, the sequel came because of a failed musical. Mad Max 2 pretty much came to be because director George Miller was working on a rock and roll movie which he eventually grew tired of. After Mad Max came out and was the popular hit it was, suddenly Hollywood had its eye on the Australian director, as he was offered many directing opportunities, one of them being the Rambo action movie First Blood. Miller turned these jobs down to work on the rock and roll movie called Roxanne. However, after a while, Miller abandoned the script that he had been working on in favour to returning to the world of Mad Max. Miller really wanted to return to the story of Max because he was so disappointed with the outcome of the first movie, mainly due to restrictions of its low budget. He wanted to get back, so to speak, and this time to make an epic car chase movie with a bigger budget, in order to create what he had originally envisioned for the first movie to be like. So, yeah, in a way, Mad Max 2 was sort of righting a wrong. That wrong being the original Mad Max movie, which is still pretty awesome despite Miller's disappointments. Number 9, highest Australian movie budget of its time. The original Mad Max budget sat somewhere between $350,000 to $400,000, hence the limitations that Miller felt the movie suffered due to its budget. So to make sure Mad Max 2 could be higher in quality, it had a budget of 4.5 million Australian dollars, which is about just over $2 million US, making it the most expensive Australian movie of its time. The film took a total of 12 weeks to film, and was shot on location in a remote mining town called Broken Hill in outback New South Wales in Australia, unlike the first movie which was filmed in the state of Victoria. Despite the location looking dry and hot, filming at the location could often get quite cold, particularly in the evening, and often in between takes, Mel Gibson would have to rug up and cover himself in blankets. Number 8. Damaged Max. In Mad Max 2, Max had a much more run-down, deteriorated look than he did in the first one. Like as if between the first and second movie, Max had increasingly lost his humanity and had a descent into madness. It was actually Mel Gibson's idea for Max to look torn up and unkempt, including his more rugged, unshaven appearance and missing arm sleeve on his jacket. Max is now so run down and lost his humanity, we even see him eating dog food, of which Mel Gibson said that when filming that scene, he doesn't think it was dog food, but at the same time not too sure. Most of the leather costumes used in the movie were purchased by the crew from second-hand goods stores and even S&M shops. Max's sidekick dog was a rescue dog from a shelter whom the crew had saved from being euthanized just mere days before filming, of which after filming, the dog happily got adopted. So obviously the film takes place some considerable time after the original Mad Max, despite only being made 2 years apart. But the question is, when is this movie actually set? Well, in a 1984 interview, Miller said somewhere in the mid to late 90s. Number 7, Mythological Inspiration. If the first Mad Max movie was based on Miller's experience as an ambulance driver and the real-life gas crisis of that time, then with Mad Max 2, Miller went down a more spiritual path. As for this story, Miller took inspiration from the 1949 Joseph Campbell book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which explores the structure of a hero's journey and how it translates into myths and folklore. Hence, the movie is narrated in hindsight by the feral kid character at an elderly age, making the movie a folklore story, as opposed to a straightforward film like the first movie was. Miller was also influenced by Akira Kurosawa, who directed classic movies like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo. And just as with the first movie, there is hardly any lines of dialogue, as Miller wanted the Max stories to be told more visually, in which this time Gibson only had a mere 16 lines of dialogue. Yeah, just 16, which included him saying, "I only came for the gasoline," twice. Yes, those words were used sparingly. It is also claimed that fewer lines are spoken in Mad Max 2 to show that humanity has de-evolved so much that people are starting to lose the ability to talk. Hence Feral Boy, who was born into this world and doesn't talk and basically communicates by growling like a dog. That is until, thanks to Max, he finds his humanity, hence he's narrating at the beginning and at the end of the movie. In fact, if you look at Mad Max 2 closely, there are a lot of hints of humans taking on dog traits, and vice versa. Number 6. Onset Accident. Given all the stunts required for filming, Mad Max 2 was naturally quite a dangerous shoot. So much so, the stunt driver who rolled the tanker at the end of the movie couldn't eat for 12 hours beforehand in case he needed to be rushed to the hospital. Some of the explosions seen in the movie were so big, local jetliners flying above the area had to be informed. Stuntman Guy Norris did a stunt in which he was thrown off his bike, but when he landed he crashed into a dune buggy, in which he broke his femur. The shot was actually used for the film, but it's okay, he returned to the set in due time, and would even return to do stunt work on Mad Max Fury Road. Mad Max 2 was actually filmed in chronological sequences, in order of sequences as they appear in the film, which is quite rare for a movie. This was probably done because the vehicles were to be destroyed in the movie's end sequence. But other factors as well as accidents got in the way of filming, namely the natural elements, as the location of Broken Hill was chosen for its reputation of never raining. However, during filming it did actually rain, so much so the production was shut down for a week. Speaking of the vehicles from the Mad Max universe, or as I like to call it, the Maxiverse, recently I attended Supernova in Melbourne, which is like a pop culture convention, where lo and behold I got to see several of the vehicles from Mad Max, including the police cars from the first movie, and of course it wouldn't be a proper Mad Max car display without the last of the V8 Interceptors in all its glory. So yeah, this is me hanging out with the awesome vehicles from Mad Max. If only they would let you drive them too. Now, that would have been awesome. Number 5. Mad Max had a hockey mask villain before Friday the 13th. Yes, long before Jason Voorhees was terrifying movie audiences with his hockey mask and machete, Humongous from Mad Max 2 was already rocking the mask sportwear. At least I think that's a hockey mask. It is, right? Yeah. Humongous was the bulking leader of the brutal gang of savages trying to take the small community's gasoline and oil. There are fan theories that this is the Goose character from the first movie, who got seriously burned and hence now has to wear a hockey mask to hide his disfigurement. But I'm not sure. After all, wouldn't his entire body have burn scars and not just his face? Maybe he is more of a spiritual representation of what Goose became, rather than Goose himself. Incidentally, apparently in the original script, he was actually going to be Goose, but the idea was scrapped. So yeah, I'm going with more of a spiritual version of the character. The part was played by Kjell Nilsson, who was a Swedish heavyweight and former Mr. Sweden. Bruce Spence played the gyro captain, who starts off as a crook but becomes Max's sidekick. He played a similar role in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, but apparently he's a different character. Yeah, it's confusing. Spence would go on to star in other franchises such as Star Wars and The Matrix. Vernon Wells plays the Mohawk villain Wes. After Mad Max 2, Wells became a big star in his own right, starring in movies like Commando and Inner Space, and would even reprise his role of Wes in the teen comedy Weird Science. Virginia Hayes played the Warrior Woman. She would go on to have a small role in the James Bond movie The Living Daylights, and would also star in Farscape. and Feral Kid was played by then 8-year-old Emil Minty.
Who would call themselves Minty?
After Mad Max 2, Minty had a few minor starring roles, but as he grew up, he left acting and got into the jewellery business, and is now a happy father of 2. I promise he did not grow up to become me. Number 4, Mad Max 2, the television version. Interestingly, and I do mean interestingly, in the mid-80s a rare cut of Mad Max 2 was put together for televised broadcasting. Now this wasn't a rare phenomenon, as TV versions of movies would often be different to their theatrical cuts. For example, the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, which would often feature cut scenes on their TV versions that weren't in their theatrical versions. But what's interesting with Mad Max 2 is not only did the TV versions feature deleted scenes, as well as cutting some of the more violent moments out, but also alternative takes and scenes that were shot from different angles. Which, for the life of me, I can't understand why. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad the TV version exists, as it's interesting to see the movie from alternative lenses, but still weird. It's kind of like a parallel universe of Mad Max 2. The most strangest part of the televised version of Mad Max 2, which sticks out to me, is changing the voiceover narration at the start of the movie, where they used an American voiceover, which just sounds strange.
I remember the road warrior. The man we called Max.
I remember the man we called Max. The Road Warrior.
Number 3, Mad Max 2 was supposed to be the end of the series. Director George Miller had no intention of making another Mad Max movie. Mad Max 2 was to be the second part of a 2-part story, which to me makes sense, as Mad Max 2 is an antidote sequel to the original Mad Max, in that the original Mad Max was about Max losing his humanity, and Mad Max 2 is about Max regaining his humanity, by breaking away from being the cold-blooded killer we see at the end of the first movie and saving a small community. I feel like the 2 Mad Max sequels that followed, which although are pretty good, also pretty much follow the same template as Mad Max 2, in that Max is a soulless wanderer who comes across a small society and helps them to break free from an evil threat and liberates them into a better life. It's kind of like the same story being told all over again. Maybe somewhere along the way Miller decided to make Max a savior of fallen or broken societies, but it wasn't originally like that. If we look at Max from the perspective of Mad Max being a 2-part story, aka part 1 and 2, it's about Max losing everything and then finding his humanity again by helping the isolated community seen in Mad Max 2. But from there, each story became about a soulless Max helping a struggling society. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Both the 3rd and 4th Mad Max movies are great films, but it's kind of the same thing done all over again that we saw with Mad Max 2, which I think goes back to the original idea of Mad Max simply being a 2-part story. There's nothing left to be told, so we're just retelling the same thing.
Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome came to be because George Miller was working on a movie which was to be a Lord of the Flies style film, which ended up evolving into a Mad Max caper.
Number 2, massive success. Mad Max 2 had a curious release, as originally when it was released in the US, it wasn't considered a proper release, on the account that the movie's US distributor, American International Pictures, were in the process of changing ownership. Originally it was released in 1980. There was a lack of focus being put on the release of Mad Max 2, on the account of American International Pictures' changing of ownership woes. And so the box office figures were low. So Warner Brothers saved the day by agreeing to distribute the movie, giving Mad Max 2 a proper release in 1981, releasing the movie internationally, to which Mad Max 2 became a massive success, making $23.7 million in the box office, as well as $10 million in Australia. Mad Max 2 has gone on to become one of the most celebrated car chase movies ever made, along with often making it to lists of greatest action movies of all time. Finally, George Miller's vision could be fully realised and celebrated.
However, Mad Max 2 wasn't quite Mad Max 2 in the States.
Number 1, title change. One of the strangest aspects of Mad Max 2 is its 2 titles. Here in Australia, it's simply called Mad Max 2, whereas in America it had its title changed to The Road Warrior. This was done because Warner Brothers felt that widespread audiences may not know who or what Mad Max is, thanks to the first movie's limited US release, and thus audiences may not go to see a sequel to a movie they know nothing about. So, The Road Warrior it was. This is why a recap of the first movie was put together, showing brief clips of the first movie which was shown at the start of The Road Warrior, to keep audiences up to speed. That recap wasn't in the original cut of the movie. Some viewers didn't even know that The Road Warrior was a sequel, and thought that it was an original film. And what I find equally interesting is some American fans still refer to the character as the Road Warrior. Show this picture to an Australian, and it's Mad Max. Show it to an American, and they may say it's the Road Warrior. So the title of Road Warrior has become just as iconic as the title of Mad Max. And to add to the confusion, some of the cuts of the movie would even be called The Road Warrior Mad Max 2, or even Mad Max 2 The Road Warrior. Either way, it's a bloody good movie, and a vastly celebrated movie in the history of Australian cinema.
Like Terminator 2 and The Dark Knight, Mad Max 2 is one of those rare occasions where a movie sequel is probably better than its original. At least technically it's better made. Mad Max 2 gave us a vision of an apocalyptic wasteland desert of the future, where its inhabitants dress in strange leather and punk attire. An image that has been ingrained in not only pop culture, but also modern culture, as this imagery has been copied many times but never quite as magical as Mad Max 2. Mad Max 2 gave us many contributions, not only to Australian cinema, but also action movies, and for that alone, it's a masterpiece. Anyway, I'm Minty, and once again, no relation to the guy who played Feral Boy. See ya!